Hi everyone and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This is video number 3 in the Wallsend pubs series. As I have said previously, this is not a complete history of each pub, as some of them don't really have a lot of history to tell. It is, however, a little bit of history of each pub, and that might also include some stories about what went on in some of them in the past. I hope that you will still enjoy it and find it interesting. The first pub that I am talking about is the Robin Hood. Of course, this pub is now better known as the Ship, but it started life back in the mid-1800s as the Robin Hood. The current building has a date of 1913, and this we can rightly assume is from a rebuild of the original building, as it was very much there in 1885, as the chimney sweep, Mr. Wilkinson, was advertising his business as being above the Robin Hood on Wallsend High Street. He didn't give any clues about his prices though, so I can't tell you what he charged for cleaning your chimney. The fact that someone has a business above the pub does make me wonder if it was similar to some of the other old high street pubs, which were mostly downstairs with rooms above them that were frequently entirely separate to the pub itself. And unfortunately, I don't believe that any photos of the old pub actually exist. The proof of the rebuild can be found in the 1913 licence renewal application. In 1912, the licence had only been renewed on condition that the pub was rebuilt, and by March of 1913, Mr. Foster of Newcastle was asking for the licence to be granted again. He stated that the contract had been agreed and they were anxious to get the work started. It seems that there was a little bit of an issue with the side doors, as the police had objected to them, but the plans had already been passed in 1912, and Mr. Robert Irwindies saw no reason to object to them now, so the licence was again renewed and the work to rebuild was started. However, it seems that by 1914 there were still a few issues. One of these was oddly the location for the urinal. It seems the pub had been built without one, and the licence would not be renewed unless one was built. I didn't dig into this area too much, but it would seem that it was finally resolved. But imagine building a new pub in 1913 without a toilet. It might have been normal in the 1800s not to have toilets in pubs, but not by the 1900s. The Robin Hood name is still a well-known one, and I can imagine that many of you listening will remember going there under that name. I know that my mum and dad went there, but I can only remember it in later years with a different name. In July of 1986, an advert in the papers announced the opening of Wallsend's newest pub. This was, of course, the Robin Hood, now renamed Chadwicks, with a fine range of Vaux lagers, ales and wines, among other things, so the advert said. I remember going here when it was Chadwicks. It was always busy, and I remember us standing in pretty long queues to get served. And I think that many of those drinking on Wallsend High Street in the late 80s will remember it as Chadwicks. In later years, the pub was renamed again and became known as the Ship, and that is the name that it is still known as today. And in 2023, it is still open and still trading as a public house. The next pub is the Black Bull on the High Street. The pub was certainly there in the mid-1800s, possibly originally built sometime in around 1858, when the first known licensee was a Mr. Henry Bell. There was a pony sale in the pub in 1862, when 80 ponies were to be auctioned. I did wonder if they were paraded up and down the high street for people to look at before they were sold, because I don't think that they would have all fitted in the bar. The Black Bull was often used for meetings of the Order of the Oddfellows during the time it was run by Henry Bell, and this does seem to have continued when the pub was under the licence of a Mr. James Robinson in 1872 as well. On one occasion in 1860, several of the Oddfellows, including Henry Bell, had found themselves in court after strangers had arrived at the pub on the same night as one of their meetings, and a fight had broken out, with Henry Bell and others being accused of stealing a watch belonging to a man by the name of Mr. Green. It seemed to be quite a confusing story, and in the end it seems the case was dismissed, as no proof could be found that Mr. Green had ever had a watch to begin with, and it was stated by many that he and his friends had come to the pub with the intention of causing trouble. It is known that Mr. John Turner of Willington Quay owned the pub in 1872, but it's possible that he owned it long before this, as the building was advertised to let in 1867, and the contact details were Mr. Turner's. The Black Bull, like a lot of other Wallsend pubs, was frequently used for inquests, such as that of Mr. Lindsay in 1877, who had died of natural causes. Alterations were carried out in the pub in 1921, but as yet I have not been able to find any details of it having been rebuilt from a smaller building to the one we see today. It stands on part of the high street where the other buildings were larger than the rest, so it is possible that this is one pub that was originally built as we see it now. But if anyone out there has any details about it being rebuilt, I would love to hear them. I did go in here a few times over the years. I went to some parties upstairs and also meeting friends downstairs in the 90s, but I haven't been in there for many years now. But I am sure that many of you will have gone in there when it was the Black Bull and since then as well. Over the years, the Black Bull has had several name changes. It's quite possibly one of the only pubs in Wallsend that's had the most name changes. In 1980, it was known as the Little Waster, a tribute to the comedian Bobby Thompson, which even included a life-size statue of Bobby, which was on display in the pub, which he did actually see, as a newspaper article was printed at the time with him standing side by side with his effigy. Other names were the Club, which was spelt with a K, the Steam Elephant, which was quite a short-lived name, so much so that it often gets forgotten about, and it was also home to the Companions Club. In more recent years, it has been known as Manhattan's and is still open and trading today. I do kind of feel like I might have missed some names out, so if you can think of any, do please let me know. The last pub I am talking about is the Anson on Station Road. Originally opened in 1967, the pub was purpose-built to replace the Station Hotel, which once stood on the corner of the High Street and Station Road, and was demolished when the Forum Shopping Centre was built. The Station Hotel was one of those pubs that had a nickname that stuck and was probably more well known than the name on the outside of the pub. It had been known for many years as the Penny Wet. In January of 1967, when the pub closed its doors for the last time, the then landlord, Mr. James Moses, said he believed the name had come from a time when beer was 2p a pint, and workmen had come to the pub with their billy cans for a penny wet. And he also felt the name was made famous all over the world by the sailors who had called into the pub over the years. Whether this last part is true or not, I really couldn't say for sure. I won't talk too much about the Station Hotel, as I hope to cover that in a little more detail in a Lost Pubs of Wallsend video, covering all those that are no longer around. But I just wanted to add that little bit of info into this story. The Anson had been named after the warship of the same name that had been built at Swan Hunters, and as a tribute to the pub it replaced, one of the bars was to be named the Penny Wet Bar. I know that many people believe the Anson to be the original Penny Wet, but of course it wasn't, and for most people it was never known by that name, always just the Anson, but many others would continue to call it the Penny Wet, and I do have have to admit to always making sure that people know that the real Pennywet was, of course, the station hotel. Mr. Moses would be moving to the Anson as landlord there from the Pennywet, and at the time the pub was owned by Scottish and Newcastle breweries. There's not a lot to be said about the Anson. Being a later built pub, it didn't hold auctions or inquests like the other Wallsend pubs had done, but I can't really cover its history without including the story of the singer from the B-52s, Katie Pearson. American-born Katie, in her 20s in the 70s, had apparently been travelling around Europe when she found herself in the area, broke and needing a job, and it is said that she worked in the Anson pulling pints behind the bar for about 6 months before moving on to be the singer of the B-52s with songs like the well-known Love Shack in the 80s. So who knows, if you were drinking in the Anson in the 70s, she might have been the barmaid who served you your Newcastle brew. The Anson is one pub that I did go into a lot. In fact, I think it was the first pub that I went into in Wallsend after turning 18. We always had great nights out in there. The interior and the exterior of the pub might have changed a fair bit over the years, but the Anson is still open and trading as a pub today, and I am sure that many Wallsenders will remember good nights in there in the past, and many will also still go there now. I do hope that you have found these little stories of some of our Wallsend pubs interesting, and I thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.